Hi, everybody, and welcome. Those of you who are here with me now, and those of you that might come later on to the third in our 2020 series of live streams. And today we're going to talk about the critique process, the product critique process, and its relationship to how to ensure the well-being of all the people that work in your organization. If you joined us through the live stream page, please take a look if you'd like to chat or leave a comment at the chat button. And you'll also see that there's materials on that page. Otherwise, if you're on YouTube, just join the chat and tell me what you're thinking or ask a question. So before we get started, I just want to contextualize this a little. This work and the other work in the live streams we're doing in the spring is related to and housed by really the WITops, my nonprofit dedicated to retaining women in tech. We started in 2013 because of the statistic that shows that women leave the field 50% more often than men. And our numbers are dropping even with all of the efforts by HR and companies to try to recruit them. So we set out to understand why that is and see if we could create practical solutions. And today's work is part of the response to that. If you aren't familiar with the work, please go out and take a look at the at-work experience framework, which I'll also be talking about later on in the live streams, which are the key factors that help women thrive, which have been both supported and additional data gathered in our survey and now measure the at-work experience measure. From that data, we identified a series of what we call ops, our initiatives, things that we think are the most critical things that we can gather additional data on and create interventions. And so today we're going to talk about the problem of critique. This is one of the critical processes that we think companies should be doing a lot of thinking about if they want to better support everybody, but especially diverse teams. Now let's take a look at that. The data that drove us to this realization was that 80% of the women that we surveyed said that they lost self-esteem when they were criticized. Now, they regained it when they felt supported. But we need to understand that if that many people are taking a personal hit anytime they get feedback, and particularly feedback about their work, that this is something that we can, do something about. In our thinking, and often people ask us, why, Karen, do you think tech is different from other what we call hero professions like doctors, lawyers, eye bankers, et cetera. And we believe it's because we're a maker profession. Now, what do we mean by that? In a maker profession, people have to work together with different roles and different responsibilities, but a lot of face-to-face interaction and dialogue. In a maker profession, that puts a lot of emphasis on the psychosocial dynamics of people working together. But more importantly for today's discussion, in a maker profession, you have continuous feedback. You're going to get feedback from your colleagues on your work. You're going to get feedback from your manager. You're going to get feedback from the customers. You're going to think your thing is great, and then you're going to get feedback. You're going to have to iterate. You're going to have to change it again and again. And with the new version, you're going to have to change it again. So if we can't handle feedback, it's a problem. When I work with different universities, and I'd say to the professors, you must build continuous feedback from others and experiencing, getting it into the program, because we need to walk into our jobs being able to handle hearing something that isn't just, I love everything that you do. This is the challenge and the nature of a maker profession. So let's explore this a little bit more. This is a gigantic summary of all of social psychology and gender research. But I want us to understand, if we have several people in the room and we're asking for feedback on the work that we do, we automatically bring into play issues around group dynamics and issues around gender, the response to gender and other diverse characteristics. So let's think about it for a minute. If everyone's in the room, we can end up with groupthink, which is like the death to all creative ideas. It means that people are jockeying with each other and being overly influenced by each other. Or we can be influenced, like very often, by the way, in focus groups by status, or the person who talks the loudest or seems like they're the most important, and then people capitulate to what that person thinks. There might be different job roles, and the job roles may come with additional power. Or maybe we're getting so much information all at the same time, we can't process it. The conversation can get incoherent. So just by having a group of people in the room, and I want you to note this, it's the conversation itself that leads to these dynamics of being shifted and overly influenced by other people into play. Now add to that, boom, gender issues. Add to that, stereotyping. Think about if the person who is presenting the work is from a diverse population or a woman, or they're the only person, the only woman in the group. We already know that everybody has unconscious bias. We already know that we're going to be thinking different things because of the characteristics of the person who's presenting. That's why we have blind reviews. And that's why when we're evaluating performance, my favorite story is about the orchestra, that they now do all of the applications, because in that case, the way you apply is that you actually play your instrument behind a screen so that none of the evaluators can see who the person is, and instead they can take a look only at the work. Well, the problem, of course, is in our work, it's hard to separate those things. We can't just look at the work, although if we're doing job applications, we should think about it. More importantly, technology is considered a gendered profession. In other words, people think men do this work. Now, there's lots of us around, but we're still, even in the United States, only 30% of that population. Overseas, often just 19%. So if they think about tech as male, if they think about tech as hard, if they think about tech as brainy, it's going to change the way we perceive the work of people who are not men. Now, the sad news is that we already have evidence that there is performance evaluation issues when we know the gender of the person. And women are systematically, their work is evaluated as not as good as if it's coming from a man. And that is true whether the evaluator is a man or a woman. So as soon as we put this whole thing in the mix, we're getting a lot of things that we can't control that are going to affect what we think, how we receive the feedback, and the ideas that we have when we're sharing it about somebody else's work. This is exacerbated when the criteria for what goodness is ambiguous, is unclear, and we can't point to it. All of which, especially for us in UX and design, makes it even more problematic, because most of the time we are not clear about what the criteria for goodness is. And most of the time we engage in a lot of dialogue, and it's the dialogue that's getting in the way. So if we want to improve the quality of the product, and at the same time, we want to treat people professionally, we want to consider their work as work and not as work coming from a particular person, then we need a new approach. And at least let's start with the idea of a group technique for evaluating the work we do when we share it. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. The second thing we have to remember is one of the worst, if you would, it's called the fundamental design error when we take a look at the literature, but I've been calling it design from the eye for a very long time. So how do we understand design from the eye? So if you're looking at somebody's work and saying, I don't like that. I don't like that icon. I don't think that's the right thing. I don't think that code's any good. If you're using I language, you're talking about what you believe without justification, and you're saying, I would rather have it be some other way. But you are not the user. You are not referencing user data. You are not talking about design principles, which is agreed on in the field. So design from the eye, or from your personal opinion, which already we know can be biased, right, is not going to forward the innovation of the product or the success, nor is it going to be helpful in making sure everybody feels heard, respected, and valued. So we want to avoid the group think, we want to avoid bias, and we want to avoid design from the eye. All right, so let's think about it. What would it mean to depersonalize or degender or degroup the critique process? Let's get a little bit of perspective. The first thing to do whenever you're giving a critique, whether it's a formal critique of a group of people in a room, or whether it's on a performance review, or whether it is just you giving feedback to somebody or saying something to somebody, is to be sure that that person actually wants the critique. Now, implicitly, when you set up a meeting and say, hey, I have a new storyboard I'd like everyone to review, or I have a new design approach or interaction design or visual design, or we as a sub-team have worked on this because you asked me to, let's all take a look, and the group comes into the room, yes, they have implicitly said, please give me feedback. So one, make sure they want it. Two, be descriptive and concrete. Don't talk generally. Well, I don't like it. It doesn't give me a good feel. You want to look at the actual artifact and say, I see this, yes? This is the element of the design that's a problem. I'm not going to talk globally about the whole thing, positively or negatively. If we're giving people feedback on their behavior, you want to say, when you did this in that meeting, this is how I felt, or this is what I saw was received. Yes? So we're focusing on things that are observable, touchable, able to be accessed by the person receiving the feedback. And we want to distinguish between different layers of design of feedback. So the first comment you might have is an observation. I see this. This is what I'm observing, that this is going on. Now the person has to at least make sure that you're, right, that you're actually seeing something that's going on. It's an observation. The second thing is, as soon as you say, I am thinking this about it, this is now your interpretation. And as we said, your interpretation doesn't carry that much strength because it's affected, yes, by your experience, but it's also pitting you against the other person and can bring bias into the story. So the third kind of thing you can say is, well, why? Why are you interpreting it this way? What are the principles of that you are calling upon, or the user data that you're calling upon? You might say, this isn't good for the business because we agreed this is the business mission. You might say, our user data said this and this isn't supporting that. You might say, traditional design principles of interaction design or visual design say this. You might also say it's not technically feasible, or it is technically feasible, or that our salespeople can sell it, or they don't have the skills. So the point here is, when we take our observation, we give an interpretation, we give it greater strength when we can point to agreed upon non-ambiguous principles and data that support what it is we're trying to say. We move it to a level of professional interaction instead of just sort of shooting our opinions at the other person, who's going to try to get out of the line of fire. So let's keep that in mind. All right, now we're going to use a little bit of an example here. I presented something similar to this at Grace Hopper, and so we did an analysis of their little app that you use when you're going there in order to show what we mean. So this is basically one of those conference apps where you are trying to figure out what to go to, schedule things, mark them off, etc. So the first thing we start with, let's talk about what's a business goal. A business goal is what the business, or in this case, the association, says is the most important thing for the success of the product. This is not a user goal. This is what the business says, whether that's like we need these many eyeballs, or we have to make these many dollars, or we're trying to get into this market, whatever it is, if it's articulated, then we can reference it. So we created some business goals for Grace Hopper, like help attendees choose what to do and find, excite people about the program, be technically possible by the Grace Hopper resources, and hey, the brand, it better reflect our mission. If you're a for-profit product, you're going to probably add a business goal that says it can be sold by our sales force and channels, etc. So if we know the business goals and the team knows them, well, of course, it's best to know them before you start designing, because then you're designing towards articulated goals, and then you're being evaluated on how well you did against those articulated goals. All right, what else do we need to articulate? Notice I'm going to use this word articulate over and over. We're getting away from ambiguity. We're getting to outside criteria that we can reference and that it brings a professional quality into the conversation. Okay, how about your user data? Well, I sure hope you went out into the field and you learned something about your users so that you know what the key issues in your user data are. In contextual techniques, we will list, these are the key issues that we now must address by our product design. Those things should be focusing you as you're moving forward. So for example, here's a little user data, make a schedule without formally logging in and don't lose it. Or pick interesting events even if the times overlap. Or find articles to read later. Or people have to ask help to find the sessions because the maps don't work. Or not having to jump between the calendar in the app and my own calendar. These are some of the user data that if we know that these are critical, we can look at a design or a response at any level actually and say it either does or it does not support that user data. Now, if you have an opinion and it's not in the user data, well, then we know it's designed from the eye. So the more you have user data, the more credibility you have when you're talking about whether something is supporting what you really intended to do. Let's look at another example of things that we could be articulating. I'm using UX design principles here, but it could be coding principles, it can be graphic principles, it can be whatever it is, but it needs to be articulated principles. And what we need to understand is anytime we're designing, anytime we're evaluating, we're at a particular level of the design, okay? If we want feedback on how this is working for the user practice, because we're really looking at a storyboard, a journey map, an identity model, something like that that came from our data, then we're asking for feedback at the user practice level. How did we do articulating and communicating what we know about the user? Now, once we take that, we vision, we have a product concept, we're going to lay on some system structure. Your system structure is simply saying we're going to have these places. We know the purpose of each place, the functions of each place. This is how we're going to get around. It's not looking at an interaction pattern. It's not looking at the visual design. Okay. If I'm putting to you an architecture moving through the system, that's what I want the feedback on. Or maybe it's the interaction design, or if you would, the UI structure, the interaction patterns that are used across all the places in the design. And so for any one of these things, we're going to have a lower level list of principles. And many of these principles, by the way, apply to graphic design and other things like that. So for example, some for UI structure is primacy, for example. Everything that is needed to accomplish the intent of this place is in that place. Immediacy, the system's going to pop things up. I don't have to think, it thinks for me. The visual flow, when someone looks at it, your eye moves through that screen in the way you want it to, so it sees what really matters. Complexity is the screen merging multiple intents, so there's so much complexity nobody can find or see anything? Or have you dumped things in that really don't belong to that intent? Of course, consistency, so that everything works the same, that's supposed to work the same across the system. Learning, and I don't want to skip modernity, because if you are not using modern interaction design principles and you're still doing, I don't know what, folders and tabs, well, now we can say that's not working because we're in 2020 and it is not modern. The same kind of thing will happen for visual design, which can also incorporate elements of brand. The point here is that we're able to say, I want this level of review, and here are the principles that are effectively accepted in the industry. You can add on accessibility principles, usability principles, but you start by knowing what those principles are. All of this should be articulated before you start the work, and then, as you will see, hung up. So we see it as a reminder when we are doing the evaluation. So our point here is to avoid group dynamics, group think, and stereotyping and gender bias. You want to ground your very specific comments in goals, principles, data, not your opinion. This is your first principle. And this first principle works even if you're in one-on-one interactions with somebody. Yes, particularly if you articulated this at the beginning of the design. All right, so let's just think about it. What would it be to use a structured critique process? What would it look like? Now, this critique process and these rules of engagement that I'm about to talk to you about, we have used for over 30 years with diverse teams worldwide. And when we use them, people just don't fight, they don't get offended, they feel heard, and it avoids the psychodynamics and stereotypic issues that we are trying to avoid. And I want to emphasize, we were working with a client team recently, and it was, effectively a male management team. And there were men and women on the team that were doing the work. And they were at loggerheads with each other. The managers wanted them to become a feedback culture and kept saying to the team, don't just show me your design. I want you to show me your principles and how you are evaluating the design. The people were upset because they didn't know what they were supposed to do, and they didn't know what the principles were. So both sides were talking to me. They were both being frustrated, and that includes the men, okay? It's not a gender issue often. And so I said to them, well, we just collected tons of data on your customer. Why don't we start? Because this was a very specific product. It didn't necessarily have larger principles that were relevant to this particular situation. I said, let's abstract principles out of your user data. And that's what we did. We abstracted principles that are implied by what the users were doing and needed. And we created that list. Then we ran a critique against those principles and, if you would, standard principles of design. They took those principles and started their next design sessions with them, picking out the ones that were relevant to the piece that they were working on. And finally, they had a way to talk to the management. Everybody was happy. Much of the time when we use structured processes, we're mitigating conflict between team members, between management and team members. If we articulate and if we use structure, we have a way to get underneath the kinds of things that influence if people feel valued, if people feel frustrated, and their overall, smooth interactions with each other. In a maker organization, we're going to have to bump up against each other all the time. The more we articulate how we do things and what we do, the better it's going to be. So, okay, enough lecture. Let's take a look at that. In our critique process, the first thing we have to figure out is, well, what are we critiquing? Is it a storyboard like the artifact I have up the upper, or a paper mock-up on the bottom? Is it a visual design? Is it an overarching architecture approach? You have to know what it is you're going to be critiquing. You then hold the critique. What's it going to be? It could be 3 people. It could be 10 people. The more people you have in the room, the more you have to moderate what's going on. These people might be stakeholders. They might be other team members. They might be collaborating, adjacent team members, whatever they are, you have to know who's in the room. And of course, you will have to explain the process to them. Now, in preparation, so you invite the people, you get your artifacts. There are roles that we're going to talk about in running the critique. Those have to be assigned. If it's in person, everybody gets a pack of sticky notes and a Sharpie. We'll talk about why, if you're working with me, there's almost always a pack of sticky notes and a Sharpie. And you have to be clear about the rules of engagement. The group has to accept the rules of engagement. So those need to be articulated, and they'll also be hung during the critique itself. I'll talk about that in a minute. You're going to print and display the goal and the type of feedback that you want. You're going to have your physical design artifact, like your storyboard. You're going to display your business goals, your design principles, your user data, your principles of excellence, whatever these things are that drove the design and that you're going to reference, okay? In other words, you're going to focus the reviewers on what they are reviewing and about how they're going to review it. It's very important. Now we're getting in the way of the free-for-all. We're not inviting a free-for-all, okay? So let's talk about these rules of engagement. The first thing to remember is that you are there to improve the product and also potentially to help the persons who did the work have new insight and therefore hone their skill. You are not there, and your attitude has to be, you are not there evaluating the people. And this is why we start the session by thanking whoever did this piece of design. Hopefully they're working in pairs at least or sub-teams, but we have asked them, please, this product has many parts. You're working on a part. Will you go do the first cut? Will you take this section? We all know it's much easier to edit and critique something once it's in front of our face. It's much harder to make the first stab. So we want to be sure that we understand that those people are working for us, the larger team, for the larger effort, and whatever they do is better than all of us having to start from scratch instead. We're going to be working on our own pieces. So we start with valuing and acknowledgement and reminding ourselves they're doing work for us. We're not there deciding if we think they're any good, both as professional, skilled people or as human beings. Now, I want to stop here and talk about this line on the bottom before I go on to the next piece. Years ago, we introduced this notion of the mom response. Now, in our, amazing culture today, we might call it the dad response. I don't care what you call it, the parental response. But too often, when we come to the workplace, we bring with expectations at home from family. So for example, imagine that we've got this kindergarten kid and they come home and they say, mommy, look at my picture. Isn't it great? And the mother turns to the kid and says, you colored out of the line. I can't understand what this is. Let's sit down and talk about how to improve coloring. Was that the mom response? I don't think so. When the kid comes home and they want to show you their cruel thing, all they want you to say is, you are wonderful and terrific. I love what you did. Let's do it some more. So we make a distinction between the mom response and a request, which I call rip and shred. Now, when you go to work, you're not running around looking for the mom response. At least you might be, but you don't want to be doing that. When somebody is willing to give you honest feedback about your work, respectful, honest, straightforward feedback, referencing reasons to improve your skill for your own benefit, you're going to them and saying, I want you to really give me feedback. I want straight up feedback. Hey, have at it, rip and shred. Now, of course, because I'm me, I raised my kids like that. And I said, well, do you want the mom response or do you want rip and shred? And even up until college, my kids would come to me and they would say, Mom, take a look at this resume. I want rip and shred. When you give language to words like this, it lets you say, hey, I need the mom response now. Or, hey, would you please rip and shred? I'm ready. I'm ready for the feedback. When we walk into a critique, our expectation has to be, please send the rip and shred, professionally respected, please. Okay, now when I early on taught the mom response, it was to a team in Germany, all men, German men. And when we left, what they said to me is the best thing you taught us was about the mom response. Because we also said sometimes we feel like we're not sure of ourselves. We feel like maybe we've gotten too much negative feedback. And I said, raise your hand and say, I need the mom response. And you know what's so crazy? They did it and they got it. People would say, oh, it's wonderful. It's terrific. We're just trying to improve it, because we can get harsh. So remember, you can ask for valuing. It works. And when you walk into a critique session, we thank you That's your mom response, but then it's going to be rip and shred. All right, let's take a look at the rest of the rules of engagement. Start with the positives when you see a piece of work that you're evaluating. You have to keep the positives. You can't just turn on your negative hat looking for every little dink that might be in whatever this product is. If you can't find the positives, you're going to lose the good aspects of the design. We can't throw that baby out with the bathwater. So we always start our sessions asking for positives, what works, and then asking, what are the issues? What doesn't work? Look for positives, not just negatives. And as we've said, I'm getting redundant. It's the most important thing. Reference the reason for your response. That's what we agreed to. That's what you're going to do. So when you say, this is my opinion, someone's going to say to you, why? You have to support why your opinion should be listened to, whether it's positive or negative. What user data is it supporting or violating? What best practice principle is it supporting or violating? Is it technically feasible? Is it supporting the brand, etc.? And we're not accepting design from the eye. But I want to spend more time also talking about the no discussion rule. Now, this is going to be hard, but if you're disciplined, you're going to weed the group dynamics and stereotyping out of the critique process, and you're going to help each other actually gain more success. Any discussion is going to stimulate groupthink, stereotyping, interpersonal conflict, interpersonal chaos. All right? So let's remember the purpose of the critique. You're providing feedback and you're sending the group who's doing work on your behalf back to respond to the feedback, positive and negative, and come up with a new iteration. You may add a person to the team, but you are not in that room trying to redesign or fix or agree to anything during the critique session. The critique session is to collect feedback only. All right, so that means get a facilitator and enforce the no discussion rule. The critique team just provides feedback. We capture our issues, and also anytime you see an issue, you're going to have a design idea. Your design idea on those Post-its, but we don't discuss them. We don't all of a sudden start talking about whether the new design idea proposed is better or worse. We don't start problem solving, how to solve the idea. It could be that at the end of the session, you say, are there issues that we need sub-teams for? And they can go off as a small working group. That's different from a critique or an evaluation. So we are not discussing these things, we're recording them. Mediate, the facilitator mediates any discussion, not any discussion of design ideas, going to stop arguments, no talk about how things have to be, no one person making declarations. We're not doing groupthink. The most important thing you can do to manage bias is to provide feedback and not talk about it. Now, you can say to me, well, why then can't we do it all individually and not together? Well, you could. However, what we have found is if you are in the room hearing the same thing at the same time and hearing each other's feedback, you do respond to each other, and more importantly, you can get clarification on what is really meant from the person doing the design, because they may not have recorded or said everything. So you're better off having a group experience, even if it's remote, because these days we can display things. I don't love it as much as in person, but we want to bring people together because we are still working together. We inform each other. But in a critique, when you say we are going into a critique, I am giving you feedback. You have moved into another zone where your intent is to help that person grow, where your language is, I thank you, I believe in you, I believe in your skill. You are not there looking to rip and shred the person. All right, so how would we run this? What's the procedure? Okay, what are the roles? The design team, whoever the sub team, is going to say, Who is the presenter? Who's going to stand up and present the design artifact? The group has to decide at what level and what element of the design. And then they need a note taker. If the design team isn't big enough, if it's one person, you got to find a note taker who's going to capture the issues on stickies and put them in the right spot on the design. You need a facilitator to ensure the rules of engagement. As soon as you are above 3 people, you need a facilitator. And if you're below 3 people, you have to make sure that you stop in order to make sure that you are not violating the no discussion rules. Then you need your reviewers, and their job is to raise the issues, capture their own design ideas, etc. So those are the roles you have to plan for, and you're going to write, a little procedure when you invite people to come. Here's how we're running things. Okay. You can decide if you want them to take a look at things in advance, but then they won't have the benefit of other people's perceptions. They may want to just get everything they thought of out of their mouth. So there's a toss up between people who can, respond right away and those that like to mull a little bit more. All right, how do we run the critique? Okay, as we said, everyone thanks the design sub-team who made the artifact. The presenter stands up, says what the goal is, and now, this is very important, walks through the design artifact piece by piece. If it's a storyboard, you're walking, telling them, this storyboard is about searching. Okay, cell 1. I'm going to read cell 1 and tell you what's there. People are going to have their issues, ask questions, etc. Now I'm going to read cell 2. Now I'm going to look at cell 3. You don't look at the whole thing all at once. You're looking piece by piece. If there are dimensions of an interaction design, for example, the navigation, you're going to tell the intent of the whole screen. You're going to introduce the sections, the primary, secondary, tertiary, and navigation sections, what they're for. Then you're going to go section by section, capturing the issues. The point here is that you're not responding to the whole. You're responding to the part. Okay. Now the reviewers will consider each section, and something will pop in their mind, something positive, something negative. You will capture the positive first, the issues, because we're not capturing negatives really, we're capturing issues that you have to work on, things you should be considering. The note takers capturing them, or they're capturing their own design ideas. And at the end of the review of the artifact, they take their own design ideas and they stick them on that place where they are relevant. Okay. And then you can talk, you can ask clarifying questions. So nobody's talking except the presenter or the sub team. If they don't understand something in the design, or if things seem not to be written down clearly, you may be annotating that artifact as you go along, particularly with storyboards. Or they may find out, endlessly we hear teams say, well, we did talk about it, but we didn't put it here. And the important thing is for them not to talk on the fly, but rather to take it as an issue and say, well, then beef up your storyboard and put everything in. If you don't know the answer to the clarifying question, just record it. The reviewers may have design ideas. They're not going to jump up and verbalize it and destabilize the whole conversation and talk about it. They're going to write them down. They're going to put them on a sticky note for the team that's going to resolve the issues to deal with. And then the facilitator is facilitating the whole time. The fact of the matter is, working meetings can work when everybody knows the rules, their roles, and how things are done. When nobody says how we're doing things, what exactly we're doing, how we're going to run ourselves, and what criteria we're going to have for evaluating, then we have just given ourselves over to the psychosocial, and gender dynamics that happen to be in the room. And this is what we are trying to avoid. We, as one, I was on a design review recently with a remarkable designer. She was so nice. I'm not as nice as this person. And she would ask questions and she would say, consider this and all that. And I said, how are you so nice? And she said, because I was an art student. And in every art critique, which those are also endless critiques, but often ambiguous criteria, people would all leave crying. And I don't want to do that to anybody else. Well, the way you can make sure that we don't have a massive personal self-esteem hit every time we get feedback from anyone, yes, is to make sure that we treat everyone professionally. And as the person, as the maker, you want to invite that feedback. You want to crave the critique because you want your thing to be as good as it can be. And you especially want that feedback from going out into the field and testing it with customers, which of course depersonalizes it even more. And when we work as a team to create something, it's also not just about me, which is why we like people to work in groups. So working meetings with structure and principles really can work when we use a design process that everyone knows. It depersonalizes the feedback, it diffuses conflict and groupthink, it avoids design from the eye and gender bias. So a lot of the things that we're doing at WITops is instituting structure in order to have freedom and to increase well-being. So today we've talked about the critique process as a group process, but I'll bet you many of these things work with one-on-one feedback too. Think about it, think about what you're doing, and think about if you really need to tell somebody that what they're doing is not okay and how you can make sure they want to hear it and that you are concrete and you can say why, okay? All right, so this is all part of our principles of cultural change by design that is at the root of the work that we do at WITops. We have identified what we call the critical intervention points. And today we were talking about one of our key processes. I've already talked about team onboarding in a previous live stream. You may want to talk about that. We also know that we have to manage the interpersonal. And interestingly, a lot about what we talked about with critique is indeed managing the interpersonal. In this case, the between conflict in conversation, but also our valuing and jerk project is addressing interpersonal conflict. The match is talking about the way we build teams and bring managers together and what managers can do to make sure that things run smoothly. And our last piece, we just call it sneak attacks because it's a way of sneaking awarenesses and nudging change without everybody knowing it. Our career power board game is one of our approaches to that that's already out there you can buy. And we're working now on what we call process vehicles, which is ways of doing minor changes in standard practices, like for example, Agile, where we can make changes. So having a team manifesto, playing planning poker are two good things to do in order to minimize issues that impact diverse people. When, today we worked on the critique, but when we deliberately redesign processes, we can in fact change the culture. And for you thinking about it, all of the work at WITops is done by worldwide volunteers. In the fall, we're going to start extending our critique work to looking at one-on-one feedback, performance reviews, and other kinds of feedback. We'll be doing some field research across all the key job types, focusing on the informal elements of feedback. We'll be guided by our previous data. And, we want to say, what else can we say about feedback? If you want to help, you might want to be interviewed. If you're trained in contextual inquiry, possibly you may be able to help us interview. Most of these interviews are remote and interpret. We interpret remotely. If you're local, you can help build local to the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. You can help build the affinity and do insights. So, look for our call for help or go sign up on the volunteer page at WITops. So thank you very much for joining me today. And, watch out for our April 16th live stream where we'll be talking about success at work. And I'm happy to take questions now.
So I'm not sure we have any at the moment. We've had a number of people online and but none in the chat room.
All right. Well, if you have a question, shoot it my way, put it in the chat room. And I'm very happy that you could join me today. Thank you very much.